of those, very similar to a debate team. We're also a speech team. Same thing as debate, except you compete in speaking. Anyways, sorry, like I said, I'm out of breath, so I'm probably losing some stuff I was thinking to say. But point here is that it's a lot of fun. If you guys are interested in joining, it is a great resume builder to be able to put on that resume. Show future employers we compete. We are also very successful in our competitions. We have somebody who won state. We have somebody who won nationals. We also won an international competition within ethics in the spring. We won like the big international ethics case competition, which is a pretty big deal. You can also win money doing that, which is a lot of fun. So if you want to win money on the club, it's pretty fun too. Point here being, if you guys want to join, please let me know. We are also on multiple campuses, so we are both for Tampa and for St. Pete as well. So let me know if you guys want to join. I'll be sending an email everyone's way with an invite link to Bulls Connect and everything like that. And yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for the time.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, join the debate team. I suppose. Not endorsing anything. All right. How's everyone doing? How's life? Excellent. That entire side of the classroom is absent today for some reason. Which is fascinating. So maybe this is the first time we're discussing the first book of the semester. Am I right? Right? Yeah. Did most of you get the book? Did most of you read the book? Or the parts that were sent? Okay. All right. So this is a very, 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 very gentle glide path into actual textual interpretation that I think we spent enough time doing Antigone and all the associated stuff that I've asked you to read in small batches to get into a book. And the virtue of this book is that I think it does a fantastic job of explaining what comparative political theory is. It does a fantastic job of doing comparative political theory, and perhaps best of all, this book was published in 1999. You can imagine, although Islamic fundamentalism was somewhere on the horizon, it did not occupy the very central place yet that it came to for almost 20 years, or at least 10 years, following the attack on 9/11. And so suddenly a book that was, it's an academic book, I suppose, suddenly becomes incredibly prescient in terms of its ability to explain a worldview that most Americans encountered for the first time on 9/11 and were shocked by and were driven to all sorts of explanations to help them understand and navigate their very obviously horrified feelings. But instead of those very comforting narratives, which we'll talk about today, Yuban asks us to do something else, which is to engage in a dialogical method in our attempts to understand this thing that, frankly, and most of you were, many of you, was anyone not born on September 11, 2001? Wow, I'm old.
I was in the womb.
Same. All right. So it's hard for you to put yourself. I guess what's that for you is like, I don't know, what's the equivalent for me would be, I don't know, falling into the root, I suppose, I'm not sure. People were horrified. And people had all sorts of things to say about this thing that had happened to them and the people who perpetrated it. And therefore, to be asked to imagine that the people who perpetrated this horrendous act had reasons that might make sense to us, that might be defensible in the worldview that these people occupy. Not their actions, but their worldview is defensible within the worldview that they occupy. These ideas were horrific. For example, now he has the very popular HBO special, but what's that guy? Bill Maher. You know Bill Maher? Everyone knows Bill Maher?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Bill Maher was canceled in 2001. Do you know why? You know why?
He said that the people who hijacked the planes on 9/11 were braver than American soldiers because we lobbed cruise missiles from 3,000 miles away, and they actually hijacked the plane and gave their lives for it.
Right. So it was horrifying to people to hear that, and you may still disagree. You may still say that the terrorists were not courageous, but his greater sin, in hindsight, was to give these people who we were very inclined to think of purely as monsters, to give them motivation, to give them personality, to give them perhaps even a modicum of the very virtue that we would like to hoard for ourselves and think that we have in abundance and our enemy lacks entirely. Anyone see Inglourious Bastards? Right? I think that's a great movie because there's a movie within the movie of Inglourious Bastards. See, it's a movie made from the point of view of the Nazis in the Second World War, where basically all the tropes of a 1980s American action film are repeated but replicated from the perspective of the Nazis. So the Americans are like waves upon waves of like henchmen that are totally pointless in their existence except to act as shooting targets for the brave Nazi soldier holed up in a bell tower. Thank you. Right. So to imagine that your enemy has a personality, has motivations, has reasons, is a very hard thing to do, especially in the aftermath of horrific events like those in 9/11. And so the very good virtue of Roxanne Euban's book was that it shows you a glimpse into the motivations of the people, or the motivations of the people who committed those acts insofar as they were motivated by the people who were writing about this, one of whom is Sayyid Qutb, the founder of the Islamic Brotherhood, Muslim Brotherhood, I'm sorry, in Egypt. Now, we'll get to all of that on next week. What I want to do today is I want to sort of glide us into that path, into helping us understand the significance of this book. And it's made a little harder for me, frankly, by the fact that these three people in this room were not even born on 9/11, right? So my first job, is to remind you of the world that you are living in. That is about as old as you are. And maybe a little older. It may seem ancient history, but trust me, by the time you hit your 40s, will seem like, oh, just like yesterday. So I have queued up some videos that I want to show you that we're going to try and look at together. So one of the things that Euban wants to do in this book is that she wants us to think of Islamic fundamentalism on its own terms, not as something that is familiar to us, although she will show us the ways in which it is familiar. In fact, she will connect it to forms of fundamentalism that we recognize and have built our sense of self around in some fashion. But she also wants to make sure that we understand the uniqueness of what Islamic fundamentalism represents. And in order to do that, we must understand that very recently, in fact, perhaps even today, the impulse is to understand Islamic fundamentalism as merely a kind of evil with which we are familiar. So what that does, though, and I'll say more about it in a moment, what that does is if you reduce your enemy, an unfamiliar enemy, to an enemy that you know, you actually lose the opportunity to understand your enemy on their own terms. They become merely a stand-in for some other enemy. So here, for example, is, anyone know the Dutch MP Geert Wilders?
Mm-hmm.
Who is Geert Wilders?
He's like super Islamophobic.
Super Islamophobic. That is correct. It's a short video, but and Shomik reliably informs me that Geert Wilders has a very, very large head. Which I suppose I'm going to now find out for myself as I see this video. So people online, you may have to mute me over here. Shomik has sent you the link to the video that I'm about to show. So you can you can mute my video or my voice and watch the video, and we'll hopefully be all Thank you, Mina. Thank you. Wow, I don't know how that happened. I guess, did it happen automatically? Like if a video is playing?
Maybe one of them muted you, and when one of them mutes you, it mutes it for everybody.
Ah, maybe. Who did that? It was you? Nah, it was himself. All right, well, people online, you can blame Shoma because I'm not going to repeat myself. I'm just kidding. No. Thank you, Mina, for pointing it out. Let's start again. Or maybe I start in a different way. So Geert Wilders says Islam is fascist. What is that doing for his audience? It's telling them there's a familiar evil that you know about. That evil is fascism. Think of that evil. Think of all the things that evil represents. Think of all the ways in which our popular culture and our historical memory, both, where one fails, the other takes over, have drilled into our mind the very great fear of what fascism represents. Feel that fear, remember that fear, attach it now to this thing, this new threat that is emerging in our society as a result of, although he doesn't say it here, but we can assume he's saying it in other places, unchecked immigration. So the first thing we must do is we must stop immigration from Muslim countries. Not that Geert Wilders is against Muslims, but he is against political Islam and what it represents to Western values, which, incidentally, are deeply antithetical to democratic values. So he says, if we were to actually stop this stuff, look, I'm not for killing Muslims or expelling them illegally. I think we should do this democratically, because I believe in democratic values, which in my mind are part of the Western story of what Western rationalism is, what Western rationality is. And in my understanding, the results of that process, when allowed to unfold naturally, will automatically yield results that will be to the great detriment of political Islam and fundamentally to the salvation of Western societies. Now, what Geert Wilders is doing then is that he's saying that he's subscribing to a certain story that the West tells itself. The West believes about itself, which is a story about the triumph of Western rationalism, of Enlightenment philosophy, against the darkness of dogma, of belief, of faith without evidence. And the triumph of that, Western rationalism, goes hand in hand with the triumph of other values like liberty, freedom of speech, democracy, human rights, etc. In the story that we tell ourselves about the triumph of Western rationalism, as we became more and more rational, and I'll say more about what that means in a second, as we became more and more rational, we also became freer. We also became better societies. Now, what does Western rationalism mean? So for those of you who read the book, she starts with this very what's the word I'm looking for? Technical kind of language. It's not easily grasped. But she basically says, despite the diversity of political sensibilities and theoretical concerns, political theory in the late 20th century can in many ways be characterized as post-foundational. So what does that mean? Now, if you remember, we've been talking about foundationalism in a way in politics until now, right? When Confucians say, or the Zhao dynasty says that they have a mandate from heaven to rule. They're saying, if I was to ask Zhao King, on what basis do you justify your rule? The king would say, the foundation of my rule, the thing that gives my rule solidity, is not just the soldiers that I can bring to the battlefield to crush you and your friends. It is the kinds of justifications I can give to my rule. And those justifications are not open to empirical evidence. They certainly are not open to you, my lowly subject, your acquiescence to my rule. They're built upon a much greater foundation, the mandate of heaven itself. You can imagine theocratic societies, and certainly, Iran figures very largely in the kinds of things you will talk about today and the videos that I will show you. In Iran, the theocratic society, it says theology, the relationship of government and society to God himself, the unvarnished direct mediation between the Ayatollah in the middle, God, or the interpretation of texts revealed by God to his prophet, and society, that relationship is the foundation upon which government is built. Human says we live supposedly in a post-foundationalist world, in which what that means is there is no overarching basis for why our government is legitimate that everybody in our society would subscribe to. There isn't anything like that. The closest myth that we have, if you want to call it that, and I'm not necessarily saying it's a myth, but certainly people will have a hard time defending it. They will spout it fairly easily, but they will have a hard time understanding the defenses of it. Our myth is the myth of individual rights. We take these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Right? That's the foundation upon which we have built our government. Whether that's true or not is a different story, most likely. Most people will have a hard time explaining why that is the case. You just say it as an article of faith. But in political theory itself, in the way that, when I do political theory and Shomik does political theory, when I study political theory, we don't try to defend political order, for instance, or to justify why a system should exist the way it does, on the basis of some overarching principle that God told us this, or, that's what human nature is like. That story, the way in which we in the West moved away from the earlier kinds of justifications towards justifications where we say, and we can talk about this later when we get to the dialogical model of, I'm sorry, I'm being too abstract and too, let me step back. Stop, rewind, restart, a small part of it. In political theory, or in the academy, when we sit here, we can talk in this very elevated, highfalutin language about the nature of human rights and what individual rights mean, etc., etc. But for the person in the street in Cairo, in Baghdad, in somewhere else, in Tehran, the highfalutin, elevated language of political theory has no real meaning. For the person on the street, what really matters is the way in which they understand their relationship to their societies. And in such places, Eubin argues, and I think she's mostly right, most people think in very religious terms. But we in the West have learned to think of those kinds of explanations that rely on religion as backward. We are more elevated, we are more advanced, we think in more rational ways about why our system of government is the way it is, why our society is the way it is, unlike other people elsewhere, or us at a different time in our past. But if political theory thinks in that way, then it has a very hard time understanding Islamic fundamentalism. Islamic fundamentalism, like most fundamentalisms, and we'll talk about what she means by that in a moment, have a certain belief about the enchantment of the world. Now, let me see how I can explain that so that we can get to the next part of the video that I want to show. There was a time, and maybe there was a time in your own childhood, certainly to the degree that Maria likes the Hunger Games, it's still the case for Maria today. People believed fairy tales. People believed that the world was an enchanted place. You go into the forest, you'll meet, elves and goblins and fairies and all sorts of magical woodland creatures. Children believed that. But as society progressed, as modernity advanced, those things, those beliefs, could not be sustained against the brute reality of what the world actually is like. So just as children grow out of the phase when they believe in fairies and goblins and elves, unless, like the poor pathetic creatures who hang out in Disneyland or Disney World, unlike those folks, most people stop believing that. Most people end up realizing the hard reality of taxes and death and the police force, etc., etc. For us, that story, or the way that we have told ourselves the story, is a good thing. We have left behind the vestiges of that old way of thinking that was childish and held us back from achieving our potential. Whereas on the understanding that we have of Islamic fundamentalism, we think of them as unable to make that leap into rationalism. They are, Islamic fundamentalists, or any fundamentalist for that matter, still caught up in this fairyland world where they have an non-problematic relationship with the idea of heaven. Right? How many people in America genuinely believe that if they're good, they will go to heaven? Not as many, to the alarm of Christian conservatives, not as many as 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. The level of Christian, the adherents to Christianity are not as many today as there once were. But on the understanding that the political theorists in the West have of what, or political theorists or political commentators in the West have of Islamic fundamentalism, those guys still believe this. Whether or not they do or not is a different story. The result, however, of thinking of Islamic fundamentalism in that way, Yuban tells us, is that you don't actually understand what the Islamic fundamentalists themselves think. We attribute a story to them. We tell a story about ourselves, and we think to ourselves that they have the same story as ours. But we are here and now. They are caught there and then. We are grown-ups. They are children. Or if they are not children and they're evil, then they're the evil that we knew from our past, the fascists of our past, the communists of our past. So, Mark, I'll come to you in a second. So, for example, you think Geert Wilders is old and crusty. Let's give you another old and crusty person, but not that long ago. He's not old and crusty, but whatever. It's from not that long ago is my larger point. You know this person. It's from his inauguration speech. Oh, sorry. People online, Shomik is going to mail you, text you. Yep, he's texted you the. Please don't. If you're going to mute me, Shomik, please unmute me afterwards. Thank you. All right, I thought that was the main thing I wanted to show you, right? So there was a critique on the right that President Obama was never willing to use the word radical Islamic terrorism. You don't call it by its name, actually saying it. And so this is a great sort of applause line for those who had the ears to listen to it in President Trump's inauguration speech in 2016, where he says, "We will defeat radical Islamic terrorism." Now, this story of radical Islamic terrorism as something to be defeated, as an evil that is familiar and therefore conquerable, comes at the very great price of understanding what Islamic fundamentalists themselves actually think. Moreover, it comes by not paying attention to what they actually think. Yuban contends we don't really get an understanding into how we think and how the fundamentalists in our midst think. And in this realm, she counts not just Christian fundamentalists or any other kind of fundamentalists that exist out there, but also people who believe in original intent. Are you guys familiar with original intent? Anyone here?
Yes.
What is original intent?
Original intent is it's a theory of interpreting the Constitution, and when you read it in the context of what the original intent of the founding fathers would have been.
Right. So on Yuban's reading, just as those guys like, Justice Alito and Justice Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh and I guess Justice John Roberts, just in the way that those guys are originalists and believe in the fundamental sanctity of the text, in a similar way, Islamic fundamentalists believe in the sanctity of their text. And the way in which those guys get the world right and get the world wrong is actually instructive and it allows for some kind of cross-cultural understanding. She's not saying they're exactly the same, but there's some overlap there that might be instructive. All right, I'm sorry, you had something to say earlier. I kept going on and on and on.
I had a question when you were explaining fundamentalists. If you say fundamentalist like in political context, so it means that people who think with like a religious foundation, like if there's always religion tied to it.
Well, no. She actually gives us a definition of what fundamentalism is. By the way, you have more stickers on your laptop?
Yeah.
You do, right?
I do.
Since last time?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. I was like, say one, please. Let's see. Where she gives us three definitions, three elements of what she means of fundamentalism. Anybody? All right. Yes, it's on page 17. Yes. Right at the bottom of the last paragraph, it says this definition. Fundamentalism refers to contemporary religio-political movements that attempt to return to the scriptural foundations of the community, excavating and reinterpreting these foundations for application to the contemporary social and political world. And she says, if you go with this definition of fundamentalism, you get three elements that are quite interesting. The first is, fundamentalists, even if they are religious, they believe that salvation is political. So you must recreate, in some fashion, communities on the earth that model what we believe our text's foundational principles were. Second, let me see how she put it. That the question of what constitutes the fundamentals of any faith are not the product of someone's imagination, but boil down to interpretation of texts. What does this text say? What does that text say? That's what they're fighting about. They're not fighting about, they're not making stuff up to fight about. Two interpreters of the Constitution, or two interpreters of the Quran, or any other religious text. The Constitution in this country is often treated as almost like a quasi-religious text. Like, the angels were whispering into the founding fathers' ears and telling them how to make the most perfect system of government. So disputations end up being about texts, as opposed to about something else. And finally, she says, fundamentalism, although it claims to go back to the original text, whether it's from a religious perspective, ultimately it is religious in some fashion, whether it's even a secular document like the Constitution, ultimately is not trying to return to some pristine world, although the people who say that may claim that for themselves, but they're trying to deal with problems that are thrown up by the modern world. So, for example, right, this is the debate that regularly happens with respect to the Second Amendment. Even the originalists are have to make a case for, what does it mean to have a well-regulated militia and the right to bear arms when it took 7 minutes to load a gun, whereas now you have an automatic rifle that'll kill hundreds within a few minutes, right? It's a problem specifically thrown up by the modern world, and the fundamentalists say, let's solve it by going back to the original meaning of the text and see whether we get something out of that. Similarly, when the Islamic State was, spreading through the Middle East, those guys are trying to figure out as well from their textual readings what was allowed within their understanding of the Quran. And weirdly, when the Islamic State was doing this, the Al-Qaeda people were like, these guys are extremists. They're going way beyond what the text allows. Right? So the Al-Qaeda and Islamic State were actually fighting with each other, literally sometimes on the field of battle, but also at the level of textual interpretation. And she says, one of the great things about this book, and this was what I was saying on page 19, she says that thinking of fundamentalism in this way allows for the distinct possibility that there are secular as well as religious fundamentalists, and that the distinction between them is not as obvious as it initially seems. In this way, fundamentalism may usefully capture certain dogmatic strategies of interpretation and authorization in disputes about sacred foundations, religious and secular alike. Now, I want to go back to the story, though, the story that we have told about ourselves. Now, interestingly enough, both from the left and from the right, there was or has been an attempt to understand Islamic fundamentalism that basically ends up not in the same interpretation, but ends up missing what Islamic fundamentalism is entirely. So I guess he's broadly considered now on the left, or I suppose he need not necessarily be. There is this guy, no, he's not, compared, I mean, the never Trumpers would like him, the Trumpers would not like him. Anyway, I mean, I'll tell you why. So there's a story told by this guy, Francis Fukuyama, who writes this in the early 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Francis Fukuyama said, look, history, human history, its vast expanse, can be understood as a series of struggles to articulate what is the best arrangement for human beings, such that certain indelible qualities of what makes us human, our right to speech, our right to think, yada, 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 can find the best expression. There have been all sorts of political formations that have occurred in the world: monarchical, oligarchical, aristocratic, tyrannical, dictatorial, totalitarian. But for the better part of the 20th century, there were only two contestants remained on the field of battle. One was communism, and the other was liberal democracy. Ours is a liberal democracy, classical liberal democracy, where we have where we have all kinds of freedoms associated with the Bill of Rights and things like that. And what 1991 teaches us, Francis Fukuyama says, is that now liberal democracy has won. History has itself shown us through the ineluctable process of elimination that the best form of government, the greatest form of government that we can possibly hope to have is liberal democracy. Capitalist liberal democracy with free markets and yada, yada, yada. I'm doing a lot of yada, yada, yada today. Elaine. But if that's the case, then Islamic fundamentalism how do we understand that? Francis Fukuyama asks. Well, we understand it by treating it as not a real alternative that exists today, Francis Fukuyama says in the early 90s, but as a atavistic remnant, like a vestigial remnant of a primitive form of social arrangement. And so therefore, in time, inevitably, history will win out. We will win. Liberal democracy will wave its flag. And will leave behind in its wake all other forms of social arrangements, including Islamic fundamentalism or any form of Islamic rule that does not respect basic liberal pieties and niceties, and that's that. So, interestingly enough, the point I want to make here is that the story that Francis Fukuyama tells does not depend upon understanding, well, what do the Islamic fundamentalists themselves actually think about rights and freedoms and how they understand the relationship between those and sovereignty and all the things that we as political theorists in the West have had to deal with. Francis Fukuyama doesn't really bother trying to understand them, because the story of history itself, history is an actor that has delivered the final result. All of human history has been a series of experiments, and now we have the results. 1992, liberal democracy wins. Perfect. On the other side, on the right, you have this guy. Anyone know who this guy is? Samuel Huntington, or who this guy was.
Oh, yeah, I mean, he was a writer who the Clash of Civilizations thing, I mean, was basically just like that Western civilization and Islamic civilization are like fundamentally opposed, and that they're gonna come together in this big battle, and Islamic people are or Islamic civilization, as he defines it, was kind of backwards and unrespecting of human rights and
Right.
all that.
So, I mean, it's actually, yes, Billy.
Was he that guy that you were talking about on like the
No,
first or second?
That was Max Boot.
Okay.
Can I make a comment on that?
On Max Boot or
No, Samuel Huntington.
I haven't, yeah, go on.
He says this class of civilizations where we're the secular ones and they're the religious ones, but he uses very apocalyptic language in this way, like, we're going to have a final battle, it's going to be a big clash. I'm like, that's not really how the world is, dude. Like, he's trying to be secular, but he's using very religious language in this. It's
Right.
weird.
No, so I think I would not say that his argument. So this is what Simon Huntington says. So, and I can tell you that it appeared as a 4-page article in Foreign Affairs. Initially, the Journal of Foreign Affairs had an article called Clash of Civilizations, which then someone was like, hey, you should write a book about this. And the guy wrote a book about it, and now I know at least a few people who should not be allowed to have political opinions, who have political opinions. And why do they have political opinions? Because they've read exactly one book in their life, and that's The Clash of Civilizations. Even that they didn't really read. They just put it into that idea book, whatever ideas they thought about that they had from the other world, and felt Huntington had approved of them. But what Huntington basically says is not just the West and the Islam, but the entire world can be divided into a series of civilizational fault lines. One of them is between Islam and the West, but also he thinks between, Latin America and the US. I think, what was it? Should we find his book? It's called Them and Us, something like that. I forget what it's called. His last book was about how Hispanic Americans are a fundamental threat to American values. This dude was a professor at Harvard. So, you know what it's called?
Who are we?
Who are we? Yes, we are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So every successive immigrant group has absorbed these values, but Hispanics are fundamentally transforming American values. So anyway, his thing is there are these apocalyptic civilizational fault lines that once this communistic, capitalistic battle has been resolved, now that it's been resolved, he says, these old fault lines will emerge, which basically defined Europe for a long time. Now, what's interesting about that, and the reason I mentioned these two stories is because I want to show you a couple more videos about a dude who died about 10 years ago, I think, at this point. No, not 10 years ago, but maybe 7, 8 years ago, who, I have to admit, not his political views, but not his health condition afterwards, but if I could be reborn karmically and have certain skills, I would like to have his debate skills, his skills as a raconteur. And that is Christopher Hitchens. Anyone know who Christopher Hitchens is? Oh, you're going to find out who Christopher Hitchens is. Christopher Hitchens would smoke about 40 cigarettes, have about a bottle or two of scotch a day, and write the most brilliant prose and sound incredibly intelligent, just oozing intelligence every time he spoke. Would you please share on Islam and freedom of speech? Now, what's interesting about Christopher Hitchens is that he's a man of the left. Christopher Hitchens is a man of the left. He was for much of it. Oh, he was a man. Yeah, no. And that's the interesting thing. Both on the left and the right, something happened with Islamic fundamentalism post 9/11 that warped people's brains, including this great, brilliant debater, Christopher Hitchens. How about it? So it starts with some of the dude. The dude that you will see is not Christopher Hitchens. It is someone else who's complaining about how terrifically bad the world has become for ordinary people. That's not Christopher Hitchens. That's amazing. That's exactly what I want to see. Chris Pratt is creating, what's it called? Guardians of the Galaxy phase. All right. Notice the language that he uses there, right? This guy, and Andrew's arguments notwithstanding, or his head nods notwithstanding, was considered for the better part of his career a man of the left. The 9/11 happens, and suddenly something in him switches, but he thinks he's being totally consistent. He believes in this story. This story, the story of Western rationalism, of the advance of Western values, of the advance of empiricism, the advance of individual rights, etc., is threatened by a people that he defines, or uses the language certainly, as barbarians. There are barbarians at the gate, he says. Who are these barbarians? Islamic fundamentalists. Now, this is a person of the left who, in his mind, and certainly his was a very sharp mind, saw no contradiction between what he was saying and the values that he professed to hold. In fact, it was in the very defense of those values that he felt that he could say the things that he was saying. Again, yes, Nick.
I honestly really don't think he's been inconsistent, because Christopher Hitchens has always been like a pretty ardent atheist, and he uses a lot of the same language.
Yeah, well, no, you're absolutely right. I think, so there was one other video that I was going to show, but although he says it for the purposes of making his point, I just didn't feel comfortable. He drops the N-word. But in that video, he basically says, yes, I hate all religions, but Islam, in particular, is ghastly in terms of the dangers that it represents to our values. So yes, in the 1930s, I would have said it was Roman Catholicism, but today, really, the real threat, he says, is Islam. So while yes, he's consistent with respect to his atheism, he identifies a faith in particular and says that faith poses a particular threat to our values and our way of life.
Well, I was actually, when the video was going on, I was like searching him up. I was just gonna add on to what he said. It said that he claims to be an anti-theist.
Yeah, he thinks God would be a terrible idea.
He views all religion as authoritarian and dangerous. So I don't know anything about him, but I was just gonna.
Again, this is not I mean, simply because I said he's a great debater doesn't mean that I think that, one should agree with what he says. But my point was to show that you could be from the left, supposedly, and come up at this point. Now interestingly enough, here's Christopher Hitchens again in another video of him speaking from the right, using the language of the Clash of Civilizations. Both positions end up in the same place. Have a look. Show me, if you would, ever so kindly. Oh, you've been called. Clash of Civilizations.
open-hearted, here in the Middle East, on helping the Palestinians. Of any kind. The torch, okay, until they've violated, government. Quite honorable. What the public again, and be flat out different from that. So I'm not ready to do that. I'd rather fight it out. The Americans. Failed states. So,
All right, thank you, Mr. Hitchens, for that as well. Now, just to be clear, I just want to make sure that those of you who are listening online and also, of course, in person, I'm not validating what he's saying. That's not what I'm trying to show here. I'm trying to show that even on the side of what is seemingly a progressive position, you get someone who's very easily slides into the clash of civilization argument. And in this particular instance, the context in which he's talking about the riots that would happen sometimes in some parts of the world when news reports would be released that some newspaper in Denmark or in the Netherlands was about to publish a cartoonish depiction of the Prophet Muhammad. In fact, Charlie Hebdo, you guys remember that? A few years ago? Okay. The same that precisely led to the massacre of the journalists at that newspaper. And so he's saying, Christopher Hitchens is saying, that to act as if we shouldn't give offense to people elsewhere, if it requires giving up our right to free speech and the values that we in the West hold to be very dear to us, if that's what's involved, then I would much rather fight them. And I would much rather fight them, he says, so brutally that they are afraid of us, as opposed to the current horrific state of affairs where we, the superpower in the world, are afraid of them. Now again, who they are, what their concerns are, and what their interests are, is never really seriously considered. They are an amorphous enemy. They will hunt down our diplomats. They will kill us in our beds. They are the barbarians at the gates. And you can imagine, I hope you can imagine, the absurdity of what I'm saying right now, and I can perhaps be somewhat, if not horrified, somewhat troubled by the fact that for almost 20 years, or 20 years, certainly 10, 12 years, this was the basis of our foreign policy. We killed, we spent money, blood, tears, fulfilling this, like we're acting as an actor in this large story about the history of Western civilization and where we are with respect to its enemies. Now, Yuban says that that's not a good way to interpret someone as an actor in your story, because you're not paying any attention to what that person's story is. Now, she goes to great lengths, and this is beyond the scope, my scope, to be able to explain, but I can mention it very briefly. She goes to great degrees to talk about other kinds of definitions that seemingly take into account the motivations of what Christopher Hitchens, labels as barbarian. So there's another explanation that says, look, why do Islamic fundamentalists have such success in the Middle East? Well, the argument is because the state in these countries has crushed all political alternatives, and therefore these people are unemployed, or they're unable to provide enough employment and financial security. So these people, like sheep, are just led into the arms of Islamic fundamentalism, which provides them some kind of succor and relief from the harshness of their miserable existence. And therefore, rather than understanding the ideas themselves, what the ideas of Islamic fundamentalism are on their own terms, we can just read them, or the people who join these movements, as agents that are responding to external stimuli that they have no control over. Now, on one level, this way of thinking about the world is more complex and certainly has more bones to it than this fairy tale that people often tell or have told in the past. But the problem here as well is that you remove from people, the people whose ideas and actions you're trying to interpret, any attempt to understand them on their own terms. They become merely functional. So, for example, if I was to say to you, right, a functional story would go like this. Why is everyone in this class? Well, everyone's in this class because this is a required course they need to take, or one of the required courses they need to take in order to be able to graduate in a course with a degree in political science. And this was the course that best aligned with their timetables. All of that stuff may be true, right? Maybe you would have taken some class with Dr. Alec Denon or with Dr. Cheryl Hall, but just so happened that their classes were at a time when you couldn't take those classes, so now you're here. It's possible. But I would also like to think that you have other motivations along the way that come out. You wanted to read about Gandhi, or you wanted to read about something else that you saw on the syllabus, or something along the way piqued your interest. You are human beings whose actions cannot simply be determined or explained by figuring out the exact environment within which you're acting. Even if I can predict the way in which you will act by figuring out the environment in which you're acting, that doesn't mean that I'm able to understand who you are. And so, in order to be able to understand who you are, Yuban says, we must engage in a different kind of method. A method that does not rely on these kinds of fairy tales, that does not rely on these kinds of functionalist explanations that reduce people's motivations to, just bear reaction to stimuli. We must try to understand people on their own terms, in terms of the way in which language functions for them. But what does that mean? I'm really inclined to show a video in this class. Not a video, but spend 30 minutes watching a video in class. Can't do it today. But how would people feel about that if on Monday we watched a video? How many of you would be like, I'm not coming to class then? Be honest.
Is the video like background?
Yeah, because you're gonna come up with Christopher Hitchens?
It's 30 minutes of him.
No. It's Captain Jean-Luc Picard. 30 minutes of him.
You like that guy?
Oh.
Isn't that Star Trek?
Sorry, what?
It's Star Trek, right?
Huh?
Star Trek?
Yes.
Oh.
Captain Jean-Luc Picard.
Is Star Trek?
Star Trek.
Yeah, he's the bald guy. The other bald guy.
My smile is about as big as that. Right now. Yes. Yes. Maybe I will try. You know what? Maybe we can. I probably can't. But there is because I think it illustrates very well what understanding involves. How do we understand the world? The dialogical model says that we understand the world through language. What is that? So there's a philosopher. His name was Martin Heidegger. Martin Heidegger says language is the house of being. Deep. What he meant by that was, at a very basic level, is that in order to be able to apprehend the world, apprehend the reality around us, we need categories within which to place it. Those categories come to us not as the product of our own invention. We don't create our own categories through which we interpret the world. We inherit categories from the cultures into which we are born. All of us. The very fact that you have a language or multiple languages that you're able to speak means that you have multiple apparatuses with which to interpret the world. Or maybe just one, which is plenty. And in fact, so far-reaching is the effect of language on our ability to understand the world that there are things that we're able to see and things we're unable to see depending on whether the fact we have the language for it. There's a huge debate amongst classicists about whether the ancient Greeks knew the color blue. They didn't even see the color blue. Why? Because in almost every text, when they describe the ocean, they describe it as blood red, or wine red, or ruddy. Never blue. And this is the Mediterranean. These guys were looking at the bluest waters they could possibly find. But they never describe it as that. And so the question is, seriously, could they even see the color blue? Really?
I know there was actually like a study of this fairly recently of a tribe, I think in Africa, that also did not have a word for the color blue and instead would tend to describe blue in terms of green. And they ended up finding out that their eyesight of the color blue is actually different in terms of it actually being more like green, or I can't remember it exactly, but it was something along those lines that without the actual like word itself to describe it, it was essentially like more grouped through their psychological connections in terms of it being more related to green, even in the way that they saw it.
Okay, no, please, if you find it, can you send it to me? Because I might use it in my classes in the future, and we can certainly share it with the class today. Yes?
There's another student, I took a psych class, and in the textbook there was, I can't remember if he was a psychologist or a linguist, but he had a daughter and he decided to basically run an experiment where he would teach her all of the colors except blue, and then he would see how she describes the world. And it was in reference to like the Greek writings where they exclude blue, and he found that the way that she describes like the sky and the water and stuff was very similar to the way that the Greeks would describe things. And he I think after 5 years or so many, he introduced the color blue to her. I don't think it wasn't that she couldn't perceive the color blue. It's just that there are other ways to describe it. I think it's like it was one of those things where it's like blue is such a rare occurring color in nature that there isn't really a need for a separate word for it, especially since the color of the the sea changes so much and the color of the sky changes so much.
Right. No, but on the other hand, so here's, yes, I can see what you're saying, but there's a flip side, right? So I think in certain communities, native communities in the northern reaches of Canada, they have multiple words to describe snow. What you and I would think of snow or slush, most likely, they have multiple words for it because the complexity of their experience allows them and requires them to create new words. But then as a result, they're able to see with those words distinctive attributes of snow that to the untrained eye or to a worldview that is not able to see through language in the same way would appear as undifferentiated snow. So you're right. I see what you're saying. And I think Heidegger would agree with this, or at least Huber's version of Heidegger would agree with this. Billy?
Just to refine what I said, I ended up finding it was a Himba tribe in Namibia,
Okay.
where they didn't have a definition for blue, and so the scientist that studied it, he showed them 12 squares, 11 of them were green, and one was blue, and he asked them to describe which one was a different color than the rest, and they struggled to find the blue one. More times than not, they would point to one of the green squares as being a different color than the other.
I mean, so again, it's one of those things where I think language shapes our experience of the world. There's a larger point I want to try and make. But with using the example of the color blue, for instance, with the ancient Greeks or the Himba tribe in Namibia, is correct as far as it goes, but I don't want to emphasize too much the literalness of it. Heidegger's point is that everything we experience is through categories. Language provides us with those categories. Our sense of the world proceeds through categorizations. And those categorizations are not our own invention, but are inherited from the cultures in which we live. And what understanding involves is not simply recognizing stuff, but understanding is always about fitting some new bit of information into our categories, either fitting it into our categories or expanding our categories to fit the new information. Anyone live in a bilingual house, grew up in a bilingual house? Anyone has to translate for their parents? Even if his parents do not speak English, having to translate for them culturally what's happening. Right? You were operating in between two worlds, right? You're trying to expand your parents' understanding to fit some reality by making references to experiences they have had, but yet stretching it as well. Right? Heidegger had a student who Eugen mentions, his name was Hans-Georg Gadamer, who called that exercise the fusion of horizons. Horizont-Verschmelzung, I believe, is the German word for it. At least the German speakers can correct that pronunciation. The fusion of horizons is the process through which we understand. And Eugen says we must try to approach these texts with this attitude. This, the Christopher Hitchens attitude, gets you nothing. It gets you the triumph of making a nice turn of phrase and sounding all, erudite and stuff. Matt, when I mentioned Christopher Hitchens did the fist pump, maybe not after these videos, maybe still, I don't know. You don't get any understanding from that. You, in fact, are further away from understanding. You become stupider for listening to Christopher Hitchens, who, by the way, was the intellectual of the season in the 2010s, especially after the first 20 years of the 2000s. Well, first, whenever he died, from 9/11 until then, everybody wanted a piece of him. With this version, with the functionalist arguments or explanations of what explains Islamic fundamentalism, you perhaps give more credit to these people rather than calling them barbarians. But you don't get very far either. You just become agents in a game or in a world that you have defined. It's only through dialogue where you yourself are allowing the critique that you will read, discomforting as it might be. And Sayyid Qutb has lots of terrible things to say about the West. But allowing those critiques to resonate somewhere within you without giving up to them, but allowing for some sense of your sense of self to be expanded by those critiques. That's the mode through which we should try to read other texts. This is not just a practice that will give us more insight into why Islamic fundamentalism is the way it is. It'll also make us better people. Because this is a practice we should be doing at all times, even as citizens. Talking to people whose cultural coordinates are not too different from our own. We should try to allow for a fusion of horizons. Understanding involves becoming aware, perhaps, of our own prejudices, of how the categories that we've inherited both allow us to see and delimit our vision. It is to be able to, or be willing to see the color blue, so to speak, when you don't have the apparatus for it. Your understanding improves. And as a result, you might actually gain a better insight into what motivates other people and gain a better handle on it, as opposed to, again, that fairy tale that the left and the right often told about. So let me stop here. Let me go to Maria, but other people as well. So this was uncomfortable, Maria, watching Christopher Hitchens talk?
Before you coming to Maria. No, not uncomfortable, but it's not, you're saying like that's the man of intelligence. I have to look at like other stuff that he's like outside of this context because I don't think that's a very dangerous way of presenting it because you said like he's discussing Islamic fundamentalism, but he doesn't seem like he's separating anything. He's grouping everybody together, and it's very dangerous. And it's kind of that dehumanization equation, you know, like he's saying, get ready, ladies and gentlemen, get ready. And so it's like, ready for what? That sparks people to go out and kill.
Oh, absolutely.
Run over and shoot, and that's all happening here, you know, next door. So it's definitely like.
Oh, absolutely. But I'm telling you, like, you go and find out about him. Like, he was considered a very, very smart man. And Andrew?
Like I know he was like a big fan of him and stuff like that, and he was like a smart. I didn't get his name earlier. I'm sorry.
Use the word fan selectively. Thank you.
Yeah. He was like a smart writer and all that stuff, but like he was like, at least in my opinion, more of like an insult comic than like an intellectual, because he basically just had a lot of fancy turns of phrases. Then, like even Huntington, like I think his ideas are like grotesque, but like he was like a man of letters, whereas like you're saying, Hitchens was basically just kind of a guy who was really good at debating and didn't, at least in my opinion, didn't really have a whole lot to back his ideas up.
Yeah. No, I mean he didn't, but he was, you know, he looked very cool doing it.
Exactly.
That was his appeal. Velen?
I actually think he wasn't that good of a debater. I mean, he had a lot of logical fallacies, especially in the first piece that you showed us. For example, like he had a pretty big slippery slope where he was talking about the dangers of Wahhabism and Wahhabism being propagated by Saudi Arabia, but then he just goes down this huge slippery slope where he's like, and so therefore we shouldn't allow religion at all.
It's just forming just 50 miles from DC.
Yeah, and he's like making an argument and then just suddenly it disappears.
It's the same as that Dutch politician. They both had like hypocritical takes in their arguments. They'd be like, so what's it called? Christopher Hitchens says he's an atheist, but then he's also taking up terms through the Clash of Civilizations, and he sounds very crusadist in his arguments.
Oh yeah, he's like, what did he said at one point? Like, I'll feel better when we're able to kill more of them or something.
Yeah.
What are you talking about?
The Dutch guy, he's like, oh, I don't hate them. I just hate everything they represent.
Yeah. It was quite bizarre.
I think Edward Said had a good response to the Clash of Civilization.
Yeah, Edward Said, yes. What to tell us? Edward Said who he was and what his response. Well, we're out of time.
Oh.
So I wanted this to go on. Oh man. So I mean, people don't know what people have to do, but everyone called me. Can I teleport? Yes, very quickly.
Can I defend myself just real quick?
No. We'll have to do it on Monday. No, go ahead. Okay, fine.
I like Christopher Hitchens because he represents everything I almost completely disagree with. Because he was articulate and he'd tell you what he really thought and you would have to guess or like come to your own conclusion what he said. He represented almost everything I completely disagree with. And that's why I like
But
them.
but the point, the reason I wanted to show you this is because this opinion was the received opinion. The spokesperson was considered the most articulate spokesperson for a view that was considered respectable. Yes, now, what's your name?
Marcela, I'm curious though, when you say he was considered best leader or whatever, where?